To this COVID-19 Healthcare Coalition webinar on counterfeit mitigation. I'm Taylor Wilkerson with MITRE. I lead the coalition supply chain efforts. And today we're going to be discussing how we can better work across industry and government sectors to better manage counterfeit risks in the COVID-19 supply chains. This is the third of 3 webinars we are presenting on counterfeit mitigation. The first was on November 19th and the second was on December 2nd. And both of those were recorded and are available on the coalition website. I do want to take a moment to thank the team that has helped to organize these webinars, Karen Conway of GHX, Carrie McCarthy of LMI, Fred Kranz of St. Ange, Greg Moulthrop, Kevin Smith, and Shelley Pack of rfxcel, and Susan Ginnivan and Beverly Wood of MITRE. This webinar is being recorded, and as I mentioned, will be posted on the coalition website with the other 2 that were already done. That website is c19hcc.org. And we are going to save some time for questions from attendees today. So please, as the discussion moves along, if you have questions, put them in the webinar chat, and we will collect those and give those to the panelists towards the end of our discussion today. So I'm very happy to have Kevin Smith of rfxcel with us to moderate today's discussion. So with no further points from me, I'd like to turn things over to Kevin.
Well, thanks, Taylor. And hello, and thank you all for being with us today. My name is Kevin Smith. I'm the Senior Government Affairs Advisor for rfxcel and also a member of the COVID-19 Healthcare Coalition. And it's my privilege to be your moderator for today's webinar. As Taylor said, the theme of this webinar is improving and/or creating collaboration and coordination across industry, healthcare, law enforcement, government, federal, state, and local to work together to mitigate the impact of counterfeiting. And I would like to introduce real briefly our panelists today, and I will attempt to share real quick. So our panelists today will be Dr. Dwayne Kaniva, is the Chief Medical Officer of the Department of Homeland Security. Dr. Alex Eastman is the Senior Medical Officer of Operations with the Department of Homeland Security. We may or may not hear from Dr. Eastman a little bit later. He was unable to be with us at the start. We also have Aaron Graham, who is the Executive Director of Brand Safety and Security with Boehringer, Ingelheim. I don't know if I said that right, Aaron, I apologize. Also Sarah Hilderbrand, Chief Operations Officer with NASPO ValuePoint, which is the National Association of State Procurement Officials, and Raj Sharma, founder and CEO of the Public Spend Forum. So let me just continue with a few comments before we introduce our panelists and start it. I'll make some comments here. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in significant disruptions of healthcare and other supply chains around the world. The origins of the pandemic in Chinese manufacturing regions has disrupted global supply as factories closed and transportation was curtailed. So at the same time, global healthcare saw a sharp increase in demand for many different products to support the treatment of COVID-19 patients. The result has been a severe strain on supply chains, caught between a spike in demand and a constrained supply. Now, during the surge in the US, organizations quickly reacted with a flurry of activity to meet as much demand as possible. And supply chain personnel from the store clerk to the CEO embraced innovation, bent the rules, and did the impossible to keep hospitals running and workers protected. Meeting the needs of the nation as the pandemic continues in this country is going to require a supply chain built on a systems perspective with a rapid responsibility, a systems agility, while maintaining its integrity for safety and security. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, counterfeiters who have long preyed on vulnerable consumers to make a profit have also taken advantage of consumers' increased anxiety and fear, the high demand for certain goods, and the substantial increase in e-commerce that was necessitated by social distancing measures. COVID-19 has required manufacturers to adapt to new demands and innovate new products at record speeds, further complicating the whole challenges of fighting counterfeits. So let me sum up briefly about the impact and the cost of counterfeits. Counterfeits threaten manufacturers' investments in innovation and violate manufacturers' intellectual property rights. Manufacturers in the United States perform nearly 2/3 of all private sector research and development, totaling $271 billion in 2018. So safeguarding manufacturers' intellectual property rights is critical to manufacturers' continued ability to grow and how they innovate. Now, counterfeiters undermine the brand names and the business reputations that manufacturers invest money and time to establish. And counterfeiters infringe on trademarks and confuse consumers as to the quality and the origin of products and services. They undermine the confidence and quality that trademark laws are intended to support. And counterfeits force manufacturers to divert resources away from critical business operations and focus on policing platforms and protecting their brands. Companies spend huge sums to employ global networks of investigators, retain brand protection experts, and pursue enforcement against these counterfeiters. Each dollar spent to fight counterfeits, is a dollar not spent to improve products, develop new technologies, grow employee wages, or create new jobs. The economic costs, with counterfeits making up only 3.3% of total merchandise trade, the US economic impacts are staggering. For 2019, counterfeiting would have subtracted nearly $131 billion from the US economy, including direct, indirect, and induced economic impacts. That means $22.3 billion of lost labor income, over 325,000 fewer jobs, $5.6 billion of lost federal tax revenues, and nearly $4 trillion less in state and local tax collections. And consumers come in direct contact with some of the most common types of counterfeit products that exist, including things like cosmetics, toys, and pharmaceuticals. And many pose real dangers to their health and safety, whether it's a worker who now has counterfeit equipment or people at home using counterfeit extension cords that are more susceptible to overheating and causing a fire, or taking counterfeit prescription drugs that are laced with drywall powder, one of the most common adulterants. The COVID-19 pandemic has made the threat to consumers even more obvious. The appearance of fake testing kits, unsafe pharmaceuticals, and counterfeit masks has caused confusion among anxious consumers, and it's elevated public health risks in this current crisis. Now, unfortunately, healthcare products will continue to be one of the most commonly targeted industries for counterfeiters. And this pandemic underscores the urgent need for a strong policy framework to combat the illicit trade of fake, falsified, and substandard medical products and medicines. This framework should include stronger provisions for preventing the availability of illicit products online, and stronger measures are also needed to keep illicit pharmaceuticals out of the physical supply chain, including postal and express carrier infrastructures. Finally, consumer awareness must be increased nationally and internationally. It's imperative to protect patients, healthcare systems, and the wider society from the negative impacts of substandard, falsified, unregistered, and unlicensed medical products. Now, for better or worse, the supply chain difficulties of the COVID-19 response have raised awareness of the critical importance of an effective, safe, and secure supply chain, which brings me back to our theme today. What can be done to create and improve collaboration and coordination across industry, healthcare, law enforcement, government, to work together to mitigate counterfeiting? And so with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist today, Dr. Duane Kaniva. Dr. Duane Kaniva is the Chief Medical Officer of the Department of Homeland Security, appointed by President Trump in April of 2018 to serve as the Principal Advisor to the Secretary, the Assistant Secretary for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction, and FEMA, the FEMA Administrator, and DHS Senior Leadership on medical and public health issues related to natural disasters, acts of terrorism, and other man-made disasters. His more than 30 years in federal service range from the tactical to the strategic and national security. And Dr. Kaniva, welcome back today, and the floor is yours, sir. I think you're muted, Dr. Kaniva.
Rookie mistake. This far in COVID, yeah, shouldn't be falling for that. Thanks for that introduction, and I'm going to try to share my screen and show you some of the work that we're doing. We recognize that this problem has been huge and ongoing. Since April, we started meeting with our interagency partners. Can you see the screen?
No.
We're not seeing it yet.
Okay. Should be sharing now.
Oh, got it.
And so what we've been looking at is exactly what Kevin has spoken to, and recognizing from our vantage point in Homeland Security, where we're largely a law enforcement agency, understanding the chasm that occurs oftentimes between public safety law enforcement and the public healthcare sector. And these are both critical sectors recognized by our national response framework, and prominent on the front lines, obviously, in the COVID-19 response. And it is two communities who oftentimes don't work together effectively when they need to the most. And so when we looked at the marketplace for the medical countermeasures for COVID-19, we recognized that this ongoing issue, as Kevin spoke to, is particularly prominent in the COVID-19 response because of the supply-demand mismatch between the simple commodities, masks, N95 masks in particular, the gloves, gowns, eye protection, and then it extends into even more critical areas like the critical medications, the test kits, the medical devices and diagnostics, and now the vaccines. And so anything that has intrinsic value, and particularly where there's a supply-demand mismatch, the counterfeiters around the world, and particularly in the global demand-supply mismatch, will take advantage of that. And so we started seeing that pretty quickly. So I know this says there's some controlled and classified information. I'm not going to display any to you today, but just wanted to show you some of the efforts that we've been looking at since late April, and trying to come to an effective interagency solutions at the federal level. And here's the crux of the problem. You see a real mask on top, a fake mask on the bottom. The font is different, and you can recognize that if you know what to look for. But the text is and the content is the same. And if you don't know what you're looking for, if you don't realize that, you're going to get an N95 mask that does not protect you or your workforce. And then here's another example from the mask, N95 mask situation. Again, two different masks. The only way to tell these two apart is by doing validation testing with pretty sophisticated testing machinery that most laboratories and most hospitals don't have. And so NIOSH, the National Personal Protective Technology Laboratory, NPPTL, is the federal agency that has the lead determination for validating these masks. And there are some, obviously, industry, those manufacturers that produce those have the right gear to do that, and some academic centers may, but telling these two apart just by observing them is nearly impossible to do. There might be some difference in the shade of the red, but the font here that the counterfeiters have matched the font and even the mask design effectively. One mask works, the other doesn't. And so that's the level of counterfeiting that we're running into, that we need to address, not just with a government effort, but this is a whole of nation response. And that's why it's so important to have a coherent effort across the nation to look at this. And so I just wanted to show some of the goals. We've got just aligning public safety, law enforcement with public health. I already mentioned that, and eventually extending it beyond the simple PPE to where the fraudulent and falsification activity goes, and then make sure that we have an ongoing, stable, secure, competitive manufacturing base one of the challenges that we're seeing is the government has been very effective at securing its supply chains through the federal agencies, through FEMA, through the Defense Logistics Agency, and the White House task forces, and the task forces supporting the White House task force. But the gray markets and the black markets around that are a real challenge. And so identifying the falsified, fraudulent material in those markets has been a real challenge and continues to be in terms of understanding the scope and scale and the countermeasures that we can employ to mitigate that. And then the third goal, obviously, ensure that the stockpiles are reestablished. Once we're meeting the current supply, have enough extra to go back to those stockpiles at the state and obviously at the federal level for the strategic national stockpile, but also within the hospitals. Many states are still requiring a 90-day stockpile. That I think is something that needs to be reevaluated now in times of, we're still in the just-in-time inventory phase, and probably ought to make sure that we can get back to the normal specified use, single-use mask for N95s, for example, and then extending out into the other critical sectors to make sure that that we're supplying the PPE and the commodities that are necessary across the environment. And I just wanted to show one last site for you, our Operation Stolen Promise. Oops. Operation Stolen Promise is the federal agency's effort to bring the enforcement agencies together, and I can't get it to bring the interagency together for enforcement. If you've got any questions, this is your one-stop shop, easy button for any concerns that you have for fraudulent or falsified material. Operation Stolen Promise 1.0 focuses on PPE specifically, the CARES Act fraud, consumer fraud, and 2.0 looks at vaccines and treatments. And again, it's an easy button if you want to try to recognize fraud or report it. You've got all the capabilities of 26 enforcement agencies across the federal agency ready to support your efforts. I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Kevin. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kaniva. And you're right. I have spent some time on Stolen Promise, and it is impressive. It really is. And just like you said, one-stop shop. And there's some things later we'll talk about that. So thank you, sir, for your comments. Our next panelist today is Mr. Aaron Graham. Aaron is the Executive Director of Brand Safety Security for Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals. And prior to his current assignment, he served in a similar senior global security roles with worldwide responsibility at Pfizer, Apple, and Purdue Pharma. Aaron has appeared as an industry expert on NBC Dateline with Bitter Pills, National Geographic's documentary Illicit, The Dark Trade, and C-SPAN as the moderator for several recent U.S. congressional hearings on the dangers of counterfeit medicines and illicit internet pharmacies. And so, Aaron, welcome. The floor is yours, sir.
Kevin, thank you very much. Your introduction was absolutely spot on, and I appreciate Dr. Kaniva's comments. As a retired DEA agent, our whole approach to law enforcement was built on the task force model. As a baby agent in San Diego, I worked with the customs right there at the port. And then as I moved, as you and I talked about, as I moved into Mexico after Agent Camarena was kidnapped and murdered, we worked with the Air Force, worked with the Army, we worked with Customs and Border Protection every day. And, nothing gets done absent collaboration. And in this case, it's great to have the government, to have the public sector, to have the private sector, to have our military assets. And, Kevin, you did an excellent job of describing what a friend of mine likes to call the shadow economy. When you have so many different vectors, stealing money, defrauding patients, the combination of all of the crimes and fraud that we see really steals so much money from our economy, not to mention the healthcare. And but the other point that you made, and also Dr. Kaniva made, is awareness. So when the pandemic first hit, yes, we were concerned about getting access to medicines, but we didn't just see hoarding with paper towels and toilet paper and hand wipes. We saw hoarding by legitimate patients who were concerned if they have a condition like asthma, for example, or diabetes, that could be an underlying condition, or COVID. They said, okay, so I have this medicine, but for me to get more of this medicine, I need a prescription. But I know my insurance company won't fill this prescription until the next prescription is due 30 days, 60 days. So what happened? They went online. They started hoarding these medicines. Well, now what happened was, they were getting medicines that other people needed. People that needed the medicine couldn't get it. And then when there was a constraint on the supply, they started buying medicine from bad guys on Alibaba, eBay, IndiaMart, Facebook, WhatsApp. The medicine was everywhere. It wasn't safe. It wasn't authentic. It wasn't efficacious. And so the panic and anxiety, as you mentioned, Kevin, really drove a lot of the issues that we still continue to see today. And one of the, just to talk about the magnitude of the problem today in Mexico. So I grew up in San Diego, lived in Mexico, so it's still kind of a focus of mine. And today, the new generation cartel in Jalisco, who's the most violent cartel there, is controlling the counterfeit medicine market. And the industry in Mexico says that 60% of prescription medicines in pharmacies today are manufactured counterfeit by these cartels. And of course, these cartels are now in conspiracy with the Wuhan cartel, who provides the fentanyl. So when you look at how far this whole pandemic spreads across the social unrest and security issues in America, with the lockdown, we see more people experiencing substance abuse, and now they're getting the counterfeit prescription medicines, in particular opiates, that contain fentanyl. And who's that being made by? The Mexican cartels, in collaboration with the Wuhan cartel, who's now moved to Mexico and embedded themselves with the Mexican drug traffickers. So the instability created by this pandemic has touched every region, every family, every facet of the supply chain. And none of this gets better, none of this is improved without a collaborative approach. In our industry, in the pharmaceutical sector, we work very closely with Homeland Security, in particular with the IPR Center. So each of us creates what they call a CVP product identification training guide. And it's excellent because we can send that to the IPR Center. They send it to every port of entry for CVP. So when they see my product come in to a port that it shouldn't be at, they can immediately look at the guide I provided, compare the pictures, call my phone number, send me an email, and it's real-time action on these suspect entries. The problem is, if we don't have that awareness out to the community, then they don't even know what they're buying. It could be problematic. And so we need to raise that awareness. I was telling Taylor yesterday that the goal of this conference is so much bigger than I think we even imagine. Because while we can discuss how we collaborate in industry with the government, with other sectors, it's that patient that needs to understand that email they got is not a legitimate pharmacy. That medicine is not authentic. That medicine is not safe. And so they've got to understand, how do I vet that? And there's really simple things like safe.pharmacy. That website alone allows you to put in a website pharmacy, internet pharmacy, and find out if it's authentic or not. But people aren't aware, A, that there is a problem, B, that there's a solution, and C, where do I go for those resources? So of course, my goal in talking to Taylor yesterday is, okay, how do we take all the brain power in this conference, in this conversation, and get it to the public? Because that's the people at greatest risk. And so I just think the idea of this conference, the people that I'm honored to speak with today, and the experience on this panel, not to mention all the people who are watching as well, is really very timely, very important. I'm honored to be on this panel with everybody, and I look forward to answering any questions as they arise. Thanks, Kevin.
Well, thank you, Aaron. It's been great, and I look forward to the rest of this. So also today, we have Sarah Hilderbrand. Sarah is the Chief Operations Officer for NASPO ValuePoint. NASPO being it's the cooperative contracting division of NASPO, the National Association of State Procurement Officials. Prior to joining NASPO, Sarah served as the Chief Procurement Officer for the state of Idaho and has been involved in public procurement for over 20 years at the state, county, city, special district, and university levels. Sarah has also served as legal counsel for Baker County, Oregon, as well as a number of Oregon cities and special districts. So with that, Sarah, welcome aboard, and the floor is yours, ma'am.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. And, first, I just want to thank you for including NASPO on this panel in this conversation. I think Aaron really hit it on the head. When he said it's going to take collaboration, and I think that other key point that we talked about is communication. One thing that, we think about as an association is, how do we communicate with our members and disseminate this information not only to state public procurement officials, but to the local public procurement officials as well. So just a little 2-minute high level on NASPO and NASPO ValuePoint for folks that may not be familiar with us. As Kevin said, we are the National Association of State Procurement Officials. We're comprised of the chief procurement officials of all 50 states, the district, as well as the US territories. NASPO was founded almost 75 years ago and has a number of divisions. We've got Procurement U, which is our professional development division, a research and innovation team, conference and events, technology team. Many of us are and have been involved in public procurement for decades and really have a passion for service. NASPO ValuePoint is the cooperative contracting arm of NASPO. We've got about 60 portfolios in place. Many of them were useful during this pandemic, including a portfolio for lab equipment and supplies, facilities, MRO, office supplies. We've got the majority of goods and services that most public entities need to procure on a regular basis. And, we've been doing this using a lead state model and a sourcing team and a collaborative with a collaborative methodology for about 30 years. And I think the one thing that makes NASPO uniquely positioned to help with this effort is that we do have this almost 75 year history of collaboration among the public procurement officials throughout the entire country. So we've established a robust network of communication. When the pandemic hit back in March, we instituted weekly meetings with our chief procurement officials. We engaged with FEMA, we engaged with the FBI, with the National Governors Association. I know we had at least one conversation with Dr. Kniva and his team and the resources that they've been able to provide and we've been able to communicate to our members have been absolutely invaluable. When public procurement officials can rely on existing suppliers, that's one of the best solutions they have out there. Unfortunately, when the sources of supply dried up, when states were competing with other states, they had to start vetting these new suppliers that just came out of the woodwork. So, instead of having this verified relationship where you have a known supplier that has agents on the ground to inspect manufacturing facilities, they've got logistics in place, you've got experts that are qualified to inspect the goods and, hopefully ferret out those that are counterfeits. You also have, your terms and conditions, your requirements, your standards in place via those existing contracts. And so it made it easier for states in terms of, warranting, returns, payment after inspection and acceptance. When these new suppliers came out, suddenly, these states are trying to navigate a whole new world, overseas manufacturing, trying to directly contract, with unknown suppliers. So they're using tools like D&B Hoovers. They're looking for red flags. How long has this supplier been in business? How many employees do they have? If they only have 1 or 2 employees, big red flag. Are they financially stable? Are they on the debarred list that the federal government publishes? And, they started to get creative in terms of, how they could try and do their own inspections. We had states that even used FaceTime, and they would require a supplier, over in Asia to FaceTime them. They wanted to, require pictures of their manufacturing equipment, samples, and then keep those samples and compare them to, the goods when they actually arrived. So I think the more that, states can engage with experts in the industry, like the folks that are on the call here today, and others that are attending the session, that's what's going to help state and local public procurement officials be able to ensure that they're getting goods that meet the standards and requirements that our medical professionals need. So thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it.
Sarah, thank you. Awesome material, and look forward to your thoughts also on some questions we have for you. So next, I would like to introduce Mr. Raj Sharma. Raj is a social entrepreneur and thought leader focused on public sector management and public procurement. As founder of the Public Spend Forum, Raj is working with leaders and stakeholders across local, state, and federal governments across the world to build practical frameworks, tools, and communities to address the most common challenges in public procurement. So Raj also founded Senso Consulting Group, a firm recognized nationally for its focus on operational excellence in the public sector. He also serves on several boards, including Girl Rising, University of Pennsylvania Center for Asian Law, and Michigan State University's Executive Advisory Board and NCMA's Board of Advisors. Raj has also written as a fellow for the Center for American Progress and the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. Raj, welcome, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks a lot, appreciate it. Great, thank you, Kevin. And thank you for having me here today. Really appreciate it. And I think that bio might be a little outdated, so I'm no longer on the NCMA Board of Advisors in case someone's listening. So I wanted to just share some of the work we've done and just some tips on things we're doing in case it's useful. And so if I could just share my slides here really quick, just the context of our work. So, Public Spend Forum runs a supplier intelligence platform, govshop.com, which has about 1.9 million companies on it. So we, early on, were working with the Department of Defense. We got pulled in into really by the Defense Joint Acquisition Task Force to start looking at early March, start looking at PPE, ventilators, et cetera. So we started working with North Carolina State University, who we work with closely, and others. And as we did that, we got pulled into a number of things, including working with the NGA, National Governors Association, who some people here have worked with, American Hospitals Association, and Global Healthcare Exchange. I know Karen is on. So a number of people. So what we did is we were asked to really by the U.S. federal government to maintain the registry where suppliers could register openly. It's a free platform. So what we've done to date then is we've got about 8,000 companies now, about 1,000 of them we're calling verified, and then over 10,000 products, and we continue to verify, so this number might be a little outdated. So in really working in collaboration across all of these different organizations, we started getting all the data back from them. So we get, for instance, a regular feed from ARM, American Hospitals Association, on verified suppliers. So we're trying to maintain this local open platform where anybody can come in and search. So, and I'll share some of the experiences from that in a second in terms of vetting and verifying companies. These are just some of the categories covered, everything from testing and vaccines to ventilators to PPE to cleaning and disinfecting products, technologies, and other areas. So a whole slew that keeps coming together. So a few things related to vetting suppliers and what we found out. As we started verifying suppliers, some of the common issues we started looking at, right? And there were many new companies coming in with no previous track record, which was needed, as someone just mentioned, right? So there were a lot of new companies, but we needed more capacity, so that was great. But you definitely had to do the vetting. Many middlemen, right? Consultants and brokers, some opportunists, and some really legitimate, right? Bringing a lot of expertise to the table, but how do you differentiate between them, among them? Sometimes, we were getting a lot of people with few references of successful delivery, right? We heard some horror stories early on about, governments having paid tens of millions of dollars and not getting any product in return. So so that made some of the vetting a little bit more complex when you had potentially as a legitimate company that came into the market, or a legitimate expert who, let's say, is facilitating, but they didn't have a lot of references. Limited financial capacity. That especially is an issue for a number of smaller companies, and I'll discuss this maybe during Q&A. Some of the issues we saw where a lot of the new companies that came in, they were okay with larger orders, but they didn't have the ability to serve a lot of smaller buyers, which definitely creates some type of a bottleneck. So they didn't have the ability logistics-wise or e-commerce-wise to be able to say pick, pack, and ship smaller orders. And so while they might be able to take orders of very large minimum order quantities, they weren't able to serve a lot of smaller, say, rural hospitals, or smaller buyers in school systems, or very small, let's say, companies. So definitely a lot of capacity coming in, but then how do you get it out? There's not the logistics and distribution network, especially the capability for those companies. And then pricing transparency. It's something that we've talked to a number of people about. We've been doing a lot of work on that, and we're going to publish some more, but we've been looking at that and sharing some of that data. In terms of, there were, again, many opportunists, and unfortunately, and whenever you have kind of this demand supply imbalance, right, that happened early on, especially, that obviously created a lot of opportunity. And because of the lack of transparency in the market on what's pricing, who the suppliers are, which vetted products exist, that is a recipe for, having a whole slew of and range of pricing and terms and conditions. Let me just show you the simple framework we came up with, and I can discuss more later on if anyone's interested in terms of vetting. And we have a whole guidebook on guiding our vetting.
Hey, Raj, this is Kevin. Could you go on presentation mode? I think maybe it would be easier for people attending today to see your slides.
Absolutely.
It doesn't appear, and that might help a little bit. Thank you, sir. Apologize for interrupting.
Hey, no problem. Let me do that. All right, hopefully this is a little bit better. So this is the last slide I have. So this is a very simple framework. It's something that we continue to massage, but it's meant to be simple. So on the bottom, you have established companies. So how long has a company been established? Did it just come into the market, right? Or is it a reputable company with a reputable brand, with a reputable financial history, all of those things, right? So that's one dimension of established as a company. How long is it? Brand new, or is it long established? On the left, we have a history of selling product line. Now, we do a lot of product and supplier verification for other things since we have millions of suppliers. So this is just a simple framework that we've been working through and kind of building out in our guidebook as well. But history selling product lines. So, are they, how long have they sold the products that we're looking at? So let's say PPE or testing kits. Is it, new? Did they just bring this product line on? And do they have any history or expertise in it? Or is it, significant history? They've done it for a long time. So if you look at this, it gave us a simple framework to think about risk and how do you vet vendors and where do we need to put, if we classified every vendor into these buckets, and it's not always clean, I will say, like any framework, but it gave us a way to think about, okay, where do you put a vendor and what's the vetting required? So for instance, on the bottom right, the yellow, you have a long established company, or let's say top right, the green. You have a long established company with a significant track record, right? Selling the product line. So these are, already distributors and others, many of them maybe I know on, say, the Global Healthcare Exchange. And these are the larger Henry Schein and other distributors, resellers, etc. Those are easy, right? And to some degree. You still have to do some vetting, but there's a reputation. They've been in the business for a long time. Not much required there. There's still a checklist, but fairly simple. Where the work is then you move down. If you move down to the bottom right, is a long established company, but let's say they are selling the product line PPE for the first time because they saw the market opportunity and they jumped into it, and all of a sudden they have a website page. And I think many of you who've been doing some of this over the past 8-9 months probably saw that, right? Companies that do something completely different all of a sudden have a PPE page on their website. Again, nothing wrong with that. We need more capacity, but that just required us to ask questions about, one, beyond the company level, is this company reputable, et cetera? Beyond that, what expertise does this company have, right? Have they actually vetted, if they're a distributor, how are they verifying the product that they're bringing in? Do they have any established knowledge, or how are they getting the knowledge for the supply chain and which manufacturers to go to? And address some of the issues that were shown earlier, like the 2 N95 masks. How do they do that? So and then on the bottom left is the highest risk. I'll stop there then. Is the new company and new to the category. We saw a number of these. Now these could be middlemen, or this could be just somebody. We had a discussion with somebody who registered on our site, and we had a call with them. And they said, hey, you know what? I just quit my other line. I've never done this before. I think this is a great opportunity. I just want to sell a lot of PPE. That's great. That's great. Probably not the best sales pitch I've ever heard, but not the way to establish your credibility. But that's a high risk, right? So, okay, does this person or set of people, or it's a company, right? Do they actually, have what's their business record? Do they have any expertise again in bringing product on? How are they verifying the quality? So again, I can go into more detail on this, but this is a simple framework that we use, and it's backed up by more of our checklist and guidebook on vetting and verifying suppliers. So I'll stop there, Kevin.
Okay, thank you, Raj. I appreciate it. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm impressed by the experience and just the number of things that you're involved in this whole mitigation process. But what I'd like to do right now, before I come back to each of you on a point you'd like to elaborate on, there's a point I would like to look at it. All the things that you are doing in all the research and working with rfxcel in the time I have noticed that in the counterfeiting business, all my years when I worked on a task force, I can tell you that when we recognize someone breaking the law and doing those things wrong, that there are some agencies here that send out warning letters. And so never did we send out a warning letter to a criminal enterprise. We did have an order and knocked on the door, and we discussed their business strategies, so to speak. But so let me make this point about those agencies that I feel maybe aren't as strong as they should be on the law enforcement side, and that's when we know of. And I'm going to talk about like the FDA sending out warning letters. It struck me odd, and so here's my statement to you, and I would like your thoughts on this. So, despite the growing nature of the problem, there are legal systems around the world that are facing numerous challenges, all right, in effectively combating these crimes, such as weak or inconsistent legal frameworks and ineffective criminal laws that often fail, all right, to criminalize the attempt, the participation by accessories, and the possession and sale of illegally obtained medical products. And thoughts on that you may have. Is there a way to collaborate, coordinate, and help not only some agencies here within the US, but around the world? As I know a few of you know, it's difficult, but how do we increase the penalty side? Who needs to be involved in that if we're looking at collaboration and coordination, if you want to comment?
Kevin, I'll take a first stab at that, and then I wanted to highlight that Alex Eastman has joined us. And Alex, aside from being a trauma surgeon based out of Dallas, is also a federal and a local law enforcement. And so he really bridges the two communities that are in play here. And I think one of the things we have to understand, particularly in the COVID-19 response, is why do we have gray markets? Why do they exist? And we've had this incredible supply-demand mismatch that, and I point out Alex because he has traveled early in the COVID pandemic. He traveled to all the hotspots, major cities, to do put boots on the ground inspections of the responses there. But the gray markets exist because of that supply-demand mismatch, and we've seen some really desperate situations where you either have the gray market, fraudulent, falsified material, or you have nothing, and it puts the whole supply chain in a different light when you recognize that that is the actual choice for many people. And while we have the secure supply chain, HHS has their supply chain control tower now that is really trying to coordinate this on a more national level. We still have these gray markets that leak around what we can secure because there is this mismatch. And I don't know. I don't want to comment on if fraudulent is better than nothing, but in some cases it may be.
Well, I want to welcome Dr. Eastman also, sir. Thank you for joining us. I know you have a busy schedule, and Dr. Kaniva, thank you for the comments. Yeah, it is tough. Anybody else would like to speak on the point of the penalty phase of this, whether in country or out?
Hi, this is Alex Eastman. Can y'all hear me? There's a bit of background noise, so I apologize. Yeah, I was just going to say that, through HSI and the National Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Center, DHS and HSI operates in nearly 60 countries. And so we have the ability to reach out and touch people all over the world on behalf, and have done so on behalf of this effort. Part of the issue is, varying degrees of appetite for enforcement in some of those other locations. And so, we're going to continue to work the problem. And I think one of the things that Wayne has really done helped us. I try to coordinate the whole of government effort. And speaking of traveling during and for the pandemic, I'm going to let y'all keep going because it's really hard to hear. I'm sure it's loud where I am.
It is, but thank you for your comments, Dr. Eastman. I appreciate it very much.
Kevin, I'd like to just comment on and kind of add on to what Dr. Eastman just said. When we look at developing nations or nations where corruption is endemic, and we know that the sentencing guidelines aren't there for a reason, it's pretty clear. What we've been able to do, in particular, it's nice that Dr. Eastman joined the call. What we've been able to do with Homeland Security, CBP, FDA, DEA, and others is we can run undercover operations where we ultimately can lure the subject to a third country or the United States as part of the undercover scheme. Get them in the place where we have the best chance for a successful prosecution and the greatest sanctions, penalties, and consequences for the actions. So the goal is to understand, do we have the right crime from a corpus perspective in that nation? And do we have a Justice Department in that country that will prosecute appropriately? And if not, if the answer is they don't have the right crimes, they don't have the right system, or they do have endemic corruption all the way to the top levels, let's invite the subject to the United States for a all expense paid trip, 5 years of free room and board, compliments to the federal government. And our federal agencies are excellent at that. And one of the things that we do in industry, where the vast majority of us in global security come from law enforcement, is collaborate. So we might run a 6-month, a 1-year undercover operation collecting evidence consistent with the rules of evidence, chain of custody, and then we'll contact the appropriate agency and make a presentation, say, look, here's what we know, here's what we have, can we transition this to you? It's a really beautiful thing, it's seamless, and then HSI or FDA can take that investigation at a 6 on a 1 to 10, they're ready to go. They assume the undercover roles, they jump in the investigation, they have the credibility, then they arrange the meeting in a third country or to the United States, and the prosecution is effective. So I think we have to be thinking that way, because if we keep saying, oh, Every time I go to country X, the case gets compromised. I have to ask you, why do you keep going back to country X? That's just, I think Dr. Einstein told us that is the definition of that kind of behavior. So
Right.
I don't think we can believe we're going to improve the laws in certain countries, but we have good laws here. So let's invite the criminals here.
Well, and thanks, Aaron. I appreciate that. And I'll tell you, I know how hard a work that is and dangerous also, but I think it's what you're talking about that does help plant the seed. And I think with the U.S. involvement in the things and the policies that we've done overseas, it's improving, but as you know, there's still a large gap there. So anybody else would like to weigh in on that?
Kevin, just real quick, this is Sarah Hildebrand. I think from the state procurement perspective, and even going down to the local entities, right, that are procuring PPE, other COVID-related supplies, we're working internally, with other entities to put together some solid standards, right? We've talked to NIST about standards, but I think what we need to communicate to our members and other public officials is that they need to know where to report what they suspect as fraudulent, PPE or whatever else it is. But they also need to make sure that they've got qualified inspectors. So that I appreciate Dr. Kaniva and the examples, and I'm looking at them trying to, compare them. But you need to have people at our level that we have access to be able to do that inspection, whether it's a fit test, whether it's, looking at the boxes, whatever it is. If we can get guidance instruction from federal entities like yours, that we can then disseminate, make sure that the state procurement folks, the buyers in the small cities, counties, buying for the health districts, that they know where to look, they know, what resources they can tap into. And then if they do find fraudulent goods, how do they report them? And make sure that we push that information back up to the proper authorities.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Sarah. One of the mission that I undertook with rfxcel, and I believe is one of the basis for all this, and we'll talk about this in a second, but is that the supply chain, as all of you have alluded to the many things, and your comments, Sarah, especially just recently here about being able to have access to some of those resources. I think the basis of this is a safe and secure supply chain. Multi-stakeholder collaboration is deemed critical to this whole counterfeit mitigation. You all have said that. So what one or two other things would you like to see other players in the commercial supply chain and or public sector do because of the things that you're doing? Well, what could they do to help minimize counterfeit activity? Are there any thoughts that you have that you see that the things that you're doing, but if we also had participation, and Sarah, I know access to those resources you talked about. We've also talked about the outreach, and people don't know how to compare the nuances of comparing two identical masks. That's pretty tough, but what are some things that you see could help minimize this whole activity?
Well, I think it's really multifaceted, right? It's security in the supply chain, making sure, the chain of custody, how those goods are being transported. But it really starts with, some of the work Raj is doing and other entities where they're vetting these suppliers. And I think that's the first piece of this. And I know, other folks have talked about, having agents on the ground, being able to inspect the actual facility, and then ensuring that chain of custody of those goods as they move from that manufacturing facility. The other thing that we've heard a lot about is a shift to more domestic production. And I know there's been talk throughout the country. I think, Raj, you've probably seen it in some of the suppliers that have come through to get onto your platform, people coming out of the woodwork, shifting their manufacturing, production to make ISO gowns. We've got people that are using 3D printers, to create PPE or swabs or other things. So I think if we could start with vetting the suppliers and get that good pool of suppliers that we have built a relationship with, and we know that they have all those pieces in place to ensure that we're getting goods that meet the requirements, I think that's the first step. The more manufacturing, obviously, that we can bring onshore, nearshore, is going to make that a lot easier. And I think there's a lot of work toward that as well. And I think there's a big appetite for that. At least that's what I see among, the state procurement folks, especially.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Other comments?
Kevin, I'd say if you add what Sarah said and jump to the end of the food chain where the consumer is, we need to have that public-private sector collaboration and awareness raising. Crime Stoppers is an organization nationally that really does that very well through your local police departments. But there are people who don't know M19 from N19 to A19. So it's not a matter of comparing the two masks. It's knowing you can't buy that mask at the bodega at the corner of Valencia and 19th Street. That's not an authorized seller. You can't buy that mask on India Mart, Alibaba, or these other places. If I don't know that's a potential risk and I don't know I shouldn't buy it there, I'm going to buy it there. The worst example, right when COVID hit, they were selling those masks at a little tienda in LA with 6 Chinese nationals with Louis Vuitton, Kate Spade, and other trademarks on these masks that weren't anywhere near any alphabet, let alone alphanumeric number, right? But people didn't realize that was dangerous. So again, like we always said at DEA, if we can educate and raise awareness not to use the drug, we can build a border wall with the drug. We can do the same thing with false PPE and other things. If we can educate not to buy that product, then we don't have to worry about the consequences of it. And then Sarah's business and others thrive because they're selling authentic product to people who really need it.
Absolutely. Good comments. Unless there's another comment to that point, Aaron, you've led into something I really want to put out there to you guys. And towards the end here, in a little bit, I'm going to ask each of you if there's any points that you want to collaborate on, somebody thinking that way. But based on, Aaron, your just last comments, I know that the National Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Center, they have a multi-layered approach to this issue. They've got investigation, interdiction, and outreach and training to law enforcement. So let's look at the outreach that you're talking about in training and tell us, any of you, is it critical to get this information to the public sector, to the general population? And I think it is, but how do we do that? How do we do that with all that you guys do? And not that it's fragmented, but you're all doing great things. So how do we get this information and education out there to manufacturers, but to the end user, as you said, Aaron, on the end of the food chain, I call it the supply chain. How do we get that education out there? And maybe they're not going to be educated to tell the difference between a mask, but maybe it's how critical their supply chain is, the health and safety of the people they serve. So any thoughts on how you do that?
You know, Kevin, in our industry, one of the things is to talk to healthcare practitioners. So the physician, the nurse, the PA, the pharmacist, if they understand what that looks like and they're touching the patient, each one of those professionals touches the same patient. And so if they can just reinforce those messages, where are you buying your medicines, Kevin? I haven't seen you for 3 months, but you take this maintenance medicine every month. I should be seeing you. Where are you getting your medicine? And so you've got to find the stakeholders in your industry, in your supply chain, in your environment that can talk to the patient or talk to the consumer. And that's how we do it. Like I mentioned, the IPR Coordination Center early on. It's an excellent group. In Los Angeles, we do a lot of training for law enforcement through Post. We did a training one day where we were talking about counterfeit medicines being sold in bodegas and carnicerias and botanicas. And at the end of it, 150 officers in Sacramento, a Hispanic police officer for 15 years came up and said, I should be embarrassed to tell you this, but I've been buying that Mexican medicine for my grandparents at the bodega and didn't know it was counterfeit, didn't know it was illegal. So our law enforcement authorities need to be aware. Our consumers need to be aware. It's a huge effort, but you're 100% on target.
Raj, did you have a
Yeah,
comment?
I was sorry, there was an echo there. So there were 2-3 things actually, just it's partly related to the last point as well. You know, we've been working with NC State and the Defense Department is involved, and they've also been funded by NIST. So 3 areas in terms of how do you keep this going? How are you better prepared? right? One is around, what are the lessons learned here? And we definitely need a central coordination, but a lot of the things that the NC State group is looking at with NIST is, how do you build this sustainable, not just capacity, because that's unrealistic, right? There's no way you will maintain that level of capacity if it's not needed. It's just way too costly. But what is the up ramp, right? And what are the ways that, what are the manufacturing lines? What are the things that can be quickly shifted, right, to what's needed, right? Having that, and then government, absolutely, the federal government especially needs to be involved because they're going to fund it. But the U.S. national stockpile is good, but we also need a basically a guidebook and a plan to really scale up capacity and take existing manufacturing lines, et cetera, retool them, et cetera. That's one thing, and the group is looking at. The other one is, it's about centralizing information, right? This is one of the things that the NGA group did, and we started working on. And Sarah, you mentioned, it's everybody's doing the same thing. What we found out, right? Everybody's vetting the same vendors, and there was enough work to do that if we had one place to able to house this information, and ideally it should be someplace in the government that kind of manages all of this in one place, right? It shouldn't be an organization like ours, in my opinion. It should be a central place in the government that manages and everything that comes in. So we're not repeating all of that, but really that information, that transparency that I talked about earlier, that's critical. And then the third thing is really around education. The last point about, how do we teach people, what's fake, what's not? I mean, we taught the whole world about, how to wash their hands, right? And so could we not do the same thing to have a one way of teaching everybody and have a centralized place where we can send out messages that says, okay, you know what? Here are differences. Here are 5 types of things you're looking at. And here's the difference between masks and fake mask. The example that I think Aaron showed, or Dwayne, sorry, you showed earlier. So centralizing that information. Those are 3 of the things that, they're looking at as part of this group and some of the funding that's being received.
So I would push back a little bit, Raj, on the government doing this, having been in government for over 30 years. And I think, we have highly agile, innovative private sector corporations, and we have other sectors like the energy sector where we have very effective governance processes established within the private sector. Government has oversight of those, but the coordination, collaboration, the standards development and enforcement is left to the private sector. And we just need to understand, what is the best approach to this, where government will not undermine the effort or overtake it with government bureaucracy and bloat, and not allow it to be agile and innovative like it needs to. And I think we have to understand, this is like everything with COVID. There's a Swiss cheese approach to this. We have different layers or different components of the supply chain. Each one of those nodes along that chain has to have different activities, outreach, education, training, understanding of what their role is, and recognizing this effort, and then recognizing who we're up against. The enemy gets a vote here, and these counterfeiters are professional. And when we publish, look for this on our public-facing websites. Hey, beware! If you see this, that means it's counterfeit. Guess who's reading those websites? It's the counterfeiters, and we are just educating them in their iterative cycle to make, to spoof or fool, or to make their products more difficult to identify. So it's complex. We've had some great speakers in this series that MITRE has put together who have talked about these different things. And for those of you joining us, if you haven't seen the previous 2, it's worth going back and reviewing those on the website, the Healthcare Coalition website. But it's complex. It's a whole of nation response. And when we look to the government for the solution, I think we're going to be a little disappointed in the answers we get. And then the final thing I want to say is, that said, now that I've disparaged the government, there are some wonderful awesome agencies that are doing effective work. And, you know, Alex and Aaron have talked about the National Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Center, taxpayer funded, man. If you're a private business and you have not heard of that center, you need to go to that website and understand how they can help you, and you know, how to plug in if you're concerned that that your product is being counterfeited. That's what they're there for. And they are partnered with, you know, 26 or 20 other enforcement agencies working together through Operation Stolen Promise and other operations to look at this problem. And, you know, they're your best partners to work with through some of the issues that we're addressing here today.
Thank you, Dr. Kaniva and Raj and Aaron and Sarah. I mean, you guys are right on. You're nailing it, okay? I will tell you that in our recent attempts to work with HSI, in my past, working in counter-drug activities, Dwayne, I would I would echo your thoughts specifically. Sometimes we were our own worst enemy on the things that we were doing. But I can tell you over the past, I'm going to say 7 years, coming into this kind of thing, that I see a lot of hope, because I think government realizes, as does the private and public sectors, that to come together and bridge those things, as Sarah pointed out earlier, the communication is critical with the collaboration and coordination. This is an awesome brainstorm group that can do those things. And there's a lot of hope out there, knowing, like you said, the Intellectual Property Center, Rights Coordination Center, meeting with them and looking at all those things they're doing. And there's some other great websites out there that might be private or public that are doing great things. But to come together, I think we're going to learn how to work together, government, private, public sector, just doing it. And I'm going to tell you, being an Intel analyst most of my life through military and still using that, 85% of my information came from the public. It wasn't what we were doing as a military specifically. And again, Dwayne and Aaron, I know you guys know what I'm talking about specifically there. But this is awesome, that collaboration and the experience of doing it and all working together. There's some large entities that may come into being, but always having the bridge to communicate and work together and say, hey, did you know in your area we saw this, reporting? There's a lot of hope there. So I'm excited about the future to deal with this. So are there any other thoughts on what we discussed so far? I would like to ask you guys, are there any lessons learned or strategies that you all have experienced? And Raj, I'm intrigued by your company, the research I've done on you, and I think a lot of people depend on you. I know what you said about maybe we shouldn't be the ones doing it, but you know, reality is what it is, and I'm impressed. And I think the number of people that rely on you and the information that you get and share. But are there lessons learned and strategies that could be applied during this pandemic that you all believe will carry forward post-pandemic to strengthen the supply chain, both what it is and processes to help it? And that might take a second for your thoughts, but don't be shy.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's I think we'd be crazy, I would say, not to take a step back, hopefully after things calm down and we get everybody vaccinated. You know, there are huge lessons here, you know, everything from the beginning, you know, of you know, even I think Sarah can probably attest to this. And we did a webinar with a few local CPOs where everybody was competing against each other as one example, right? And that rather than sharing some vital information with each other, that would have really helped everybody, right? And you would think that's simple, but it was just like, hey, we got to cover our ground. We're not sharing information, right? So that they acknowledged that in this one webinar. That's just one simple example. From a supply chain standpoint, again, you know, the whole vetting process, we've learned a lot ourselves. You know, there's a way to triage, right? And really kind of quickly, even through now AI and everything, that's what we're looking at. You know, we apply a lot of AI and machine learning. It's like, how can you quickly, you know, as somebody comes into the supply chain, how can you at least flag them as a high risk, right? And I know there are other platforms that do that already. So So definitely, at least, we could share some more examples, but, one example I'll just quickly give you is, even simple things like, this just happened maybe 3-4 weeks ago. Somebody registered on the site for testing kits, and they said, they basically said they put up some documentation, and they said they were FDA approved for testing kits, this company, I won't say who. And so when we looked into it, before we put any kind of verified badge or anything on them, we went back to the FDA database, et cetera, to verify, and we found that, they had only registered, they're not approved, right? So there's a registered database, and there's now that providing that distinction to people, again, goes back to partly education, but partly having this. I think we were able to, we didn't know that early on, but we learned from others as well that are on this call. And, but that was a good example. And their easy excuse was, well, we got confused and we know that the approval is coming soon, so we just decided to put it there. Great. Okay. But those are, I think it's, so absolutely. I hope we take a lot of time, and not just to study and admire what happened, but to create an actionable plan going forward.
Good point, Raj. Thank you. And that brings a point too, that the things that companies do for their normal supply chain processes and what this pandemic has caused. I know during this whole pandemic, the focus sometimes was on building near-term capacity and getting as much of the required COVID-19 related products as possible to flow through the supply chains. And there were a lot of successful efforts, but a lot of those successful efforts really are not sustainable beyond this initial crisis response phase. And so I think one of the things that we need to do, as you said, is go back and look at, okay, here's where we have been, but in a crisis, we need to go here. So what's the plan to find the balance there and to be able to step up when we need to? And it's looking back and looking at those lessons learned. Just so many of those things I saw that flooded in, and maybe we forgot about just what you said, Raj, qualifying and really looking at those critical things, between registered and approved and validated and available. There's a huge difference there. So
yeah,
go ahead, Dwayne.
I would echo that. And, we've seen cases where within the different layers of the supply chain, the due diligence responsibilities they're not really standardized, right? So you can have a distributor who is knowingly in the gray market selling stuff that they got from a Chinese manufacturer that is not validated, that there's no requirement to validate. And if you catch them with the goods, they can claim victim status, right? They say, oh, the manufacturer said that these were good, and so we assume that they were. And there's no, it just makes this whole furball of a gray marketplace for medical commodities even more difficult. There's no enforcement. The trademarking and recordation responsibilities with U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and Customs and Border Protection. Companies don't understand that they should do that to protect from counterfeiting. And then if it's counterfeiting is different than various ways of falsification or fraud or substandard commodities, and all of those have different agencies, different statutes that have to be implemented for enforcing or even getting them off the market, and it becomes really difficult in a chaotic situation where there's overwhelming scope and scale of the problem to get this back under control. So, and it's kind of where we're at now. We're talking about onshoring and reestablishing domestic manufacturing, but that comes with its own problems of the labor cost, competing on labor, and realizing that when we offshore the environmental regulatory environment as well. So it's really complex.
Excellent. I would like to ask all of you, and I'm impressed and honored to be here with you guys. What's going on? And I know we'll talk again. Is there a point, anything that we've done today? Because what I'd like to do is ask each of you if there's anything you want to elaborate on for a few minutes, And I know the people that are attending this webinar have a number of questions out there that I think Taylor would maybe like to grab a few of those. But quickly, is there a point you'd like to make in what we've talked about today to stress or elaborate on for a minute or two at this point? Any of you?
You know, Kevin, I kind of like to hear the questions. Honestly, I know I've talked enough. Unless there's a question for me, I think the reason for the conference, right, is to hear some of the questions.
Right. Well, Taylor, I would like to ask you if you've been monitoring. I see we've got a number of them. Would you like to go ahead, Taylor, and bring some of those questions forward?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin.
You bet.
Yeah, I think one that came up is, we talked a lot today about the amount of collaboration that has come up during this pandemic and how everybody's working together. Wonder if the panelists could comment on how to maintain this momentum and this level of coordination once, hopefully in the next few months, everybody gets vaccinated and the urgency of the pandemic fades away.
I think that's a great question. It's something we've talked about internally. I know, NASPO's got a number of MOUs with various other, associations, whether it's the National Governors Association, the National Conference of State Legislators. We want to make sure that we continue to engage with our federal partners. But I do think that we need to put some sort of standing task force in place, and maybe it's specific, to keep in place on a regular basis, until hopefully it's not needed. But I think the conversation has to continue because it has been just an incredible help to all of our state members to be able to tap into these resources. I think, the biggest thing for me is being able to, and Raj, you talked about this a little bit, but consolidate them, right? There's a lot of great websites out there. There's a lot of great resources and tools, but not everybody knows where to find them. And if we could find a way to even put together, some sort of messaging campaign that consolidates these resources, provides some sort of a checklist, right? If you're putting together procurement, here's what you need to include. Here's where you can find some standards. Here's, where you can go to understand, how to look for fraudulent goods. Here's resources you can tap into if you have questions. If you do find fraudulent goods, here's what you do next. And I think having that as sort of a standing document and continuing to engage, NASPO with our network of all state chief procurement officials, that also trickles down to the local procurement level, as well as the federal partners who have an expertise in this area, keeping that communication and collaboration going, I think is definitely key.
Dad, I've thought a lot about this from different angles, different sort of levels within working in the health sector. I think we should look to other critical sectors to see what kind of analogous organizational structures they have. We've looked at the energy sector and the Electric Reliability Organization, the NERC, North American Electric Reliability Corporation, brings 2,000 private sector energy companies together in a governance corporate structure. They develop industry standards. They do self-enforcement. We don't have anything comparable in the health sector. We need a health reliability organization construct that brings the private sector industries and the sub-industries together to develop and enforce the standards. And you can talk about a standard of care, but without understanding what a standard setting organization is, or what the authority, congressionally mandated authority that the NERC has in the energy sector with the NERC FERC, we have nothing comparable in the health sector in the $3.5 trillion ungoverned space of health.
Yeah, well, I mean, we need organizations also like, what MITRE set up here, which is great, the Healthcare Coalition. Definitely, taking up, hopefully there's an organizing framework where we can have different organizations take on certain responsibilities. And you're right, Dwayne, earlier, the private sector has to play a huge role. And should be an interest, right? There's billions and trillions of dollars lost, and so it's an easy financial case to make, right? To fund such initiatives, and at the end of the day, there'll be peanuts compared to the impact that we're seeing, or the detrimental impact. You know, one just a quick point I want to make. I just want to show one slide really quick. I used it at a webinar the other day, and it'll take less than a minute. I always talk about this when we're talking about markets, and I've written papers from an economics standpoint.
Go to your, if you would please go to your presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be great. They'll be able to see it better. Thank you.
Okay. So, you know, I think a lot of the issues we're talking about, and then talking about how do we organize them, it's really about information asymmetry that's created, right? Like partly we're talking about, you know, not knowing where demand is, not knowing where supply is. How do you vet people? How's their transparency around that? How's their transparency around standards, et cetera? And this is, I really think this is, you know, one of the biggest issues here. It's there are other facets to it, of course, but it's an information problem first and foremost, right? And if we can really treat it as such and say, how are we going to house that? How are we going to set these standards, get them out? How are we going to, you know, have the vendors? How are we going to have vetting standards? All of those things, I think that will go a long way. So that's what we're discussing with some of the partners that we work with, whether it's the Defense Task Force or NC State and others. So that's where I hope a big part of the focus will go.
So great. There's and I think that discussion actually answered about 3 or 4 of the questions that came up. So thank you all for that. One other question that's come up around the push for reshoring of pharmaceutical and PPE production is as the push for reshoring gets going here and continues, and new capabilities, new capacity, new companies start showing up. You know, it's clear to see that there's how that helps the problem in the long run, but does that add any complications in the near term, just with the amount of new suppliers, et cetera, coming into the market?
You know, I got to think it's a tough economic environment, and you know, it's beyond labor costs. We now have huge enterprises, huge, you know, manufacturers who have had a great run economically. You know, Top Glove in Malaysia, for example, and for those commodities that are labor intense, obviously there's an advantage to offshore. It's, you know, we can look at automation, but automation capability is, you know, it's a global capability, and so it's going to be tough to compete to build in the national security aspects of domestic production lines into the marketplace. But I think it's, you know, it's important. We've got to take a good long look at how we do that.
Thanks. I think maybe we have time for one more. So there's a question asked of how do we get this information out to colleges and universities? And I believe that's within the context of helping people who are doing procurement at the college and university level. But I would kind of expand that a little bit to say, you know, we've talked a lot today about people who are in the healthcare procurement environment and in the healthcare procurement business. With COVID, I mean, especially with PPE, there are a lot of people buying PPE who aren't necessarily within the healthcare realm, whether it's colleges, universities, law enforcement, even food service. How do we get this information and you know, the things were just discussed in terms of sharing information, creating clearinghouses, et cetera, out to these other sectors?
And I don't have an answer. I do have an appendix to the question. You got to include the 250,000 medical practices, the offices that are out there, and the dental offices, and all of the other healthcare and non-healthcare areas where these commodities are being consumed. This is a huge strategic communications challenge that needs to be undertaken.
To Dwayne's point, I just want to add in 2013, counterfeit cancer medicines were flooding the United States. And who was buying them? Oncologists who were infusing these medicines into patients. And what happened was one day a nurse noticed on the medicine that the packaging and labeling was in Turkish. And she said to the physician, "Why is this packaging in Turkish? That doesn't really make sense to me." He told her, "Your job is to administer the medicine. Don't worry about procurement." So she went home, slept on it for a minute, dropped a dime on FDOCI. Doctor went to jail. At the end of the day, 83 oncologists were arrested. $69 million of counterfeit medicines have been purchased by this group in the U.S. From Turkey. And I think to Dwayne's point, I'll slightly help him off the hook here a little bit about throwing the government under the bus. As a recovering civil servant myself, I will tell you that I think industry is a little more nimble and agile and has some more resources, so at least can bear part of the brunt of that burden. But I recently was asked to speak to the graduating class of the Albany College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. These are young pharmacists. They're going to hit the field, some of them in independent pharmacies. And I talked to them about this. People will call on you and offer these prescription medicines. Well, you got to ask them, who are they? If they're not McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, or the big three, who are they? Why are they talking to you? And here's the threat they pose. So I think colleges are a great place to talk to the next generation of leaders, buyers, healthcare professionals, and it's really a great piece of the equation that I think we're missing today, and that we can hit. And I'll just come back to put more burden on DHS. The IPR Center really is a great place to get the information out there. There's so many people, Dwayne, that don't know if you don't have your trademark recorded with CBP, they're not going to seize it to begin with. Well, a lot of companies don't even know what a customs recordation is. So I know a friend of mine just recently registered their animal health products with CBP because CBP was seeing them at the ports, not calling anybody because they don't have the authority to act if you haven't recorded your trademark. So there's just so many facets to this. I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I think for any brand owner, for any business person, the IPR Center is a place to start and say, what am I missing, right? Where am I at risk? What are my vulnerabilities? Somebody of those 27, 28 agencies will tell you. And getting a briefing, just go there for a briefing, for your initial briefing in the big conference room. It's going to be an aha moment for virtually every brand owner and other constituents.
All right, well, I think that brings us to time for this webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I especially want to thank Kevin Smith for his excellent job moderating, as well as our panelists, Dwayne Kneva, Aaron Graham, Sarah Hilderbrand, Raj Sharma, and for Alex Eastman as well for joining in. The recording of this webinar, along with the first two, will be posted on the COVID-19 Healthcare Coalition website at c19hcc.org. This concludes our three-part webinar series on counterfeit mitigation. We are also developing a paper that will summarize the discussions of these three webinars. But we also want to hear back from you, the attendees, about any topics that we did not address during these webinars. So if there's anything that you wish we had addressed during these three webinars but didn't, we'd love to hear and see if there's value in continuing the series to address additional topics. So I want to thank everybody again for attending. Wish you have a great rest of your day, and please stay safe and have happy holidays.
It was an honor, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.